Outrage boils over in National City after a man's unexplained death. What happened to Earl McNeil during an encounter with police? San Diego finally has a plan for short-term rentals, but it will be another year before it takes effect. And energy regulators huddle in off-the-record meetings, the discussions about San Onofre that are just coming to light now. I'm Mark Sauer. The KPBS Roundtable starts now. Welcome to our discussion of the week's top stories. I'm Mark Sauer, and joining me at the KPBS Roundtable today, reporter Jade Heidman of KPBS, Metro reporter Andrew Bowen of KPBS, and watchdog reporter Jeff McDonald of the San Diego Union Tribune. It's going on 2 months, and protesters in National City show no signs of backing down. They disrupted the city council meeting for a third time this week. It's over the death in custody of a black man, Earl McNeil. Here's some of that confrontation at City Hall.
I urge you to do anything in your power so that we don't go down in flames and we become the Ferguson of the West Coast, and that we are not going to be killing this community. You have to send a message.
What I can guarantee you is that we're going to ask the nation to come to National City, the entire nation. We're going to ask them to come by the busloads.
I'm not threatening you. I said I wish I could do
she's
that.
She's going to take me outside and slap me. Is she threatening
I said
me?
I wish I could take you outside.
She threatening me?
Well, nasty stuff, Jade. Protesters are especially angry at Police Chief Manuel Rodriguez. What are their specific demands and his response?
Well, they want transparency. They want to know what happened to Earl McNeil. They want any police video that they may have, whether that be dash cam video or body cam video. They want to see the medical examiner's report. So far, they've not gotten any of that from the police department. They say it's all under investigation.
All right, so let's go into the details of this particular case. Start with Mr. McNeil. Why was he arrested? How did he end up in the hospital?
So all of this happened on May 26th. He showed up in front of the National City Police Department to use the phone. He wanted to reach an officer. He got dispatched and he said, you know what, I'm high, I have a warrant, and I want to kill Jesus. At which point officers came out to meet him. And they say, according to the statement that National City Police Department released, that he became combative, was agitated, was paranoid. So they put him in a restraint. And then they suspected him of drug use, and they say that they found an illegal substance on him. So he was arrested, put in that restraint, and they took him to jail. At some point during transport, and when he got to the jail, the San Diego County Jail, where they did not take him in, they rejected intake on him, he stopped breathing. So paramedics resuscitated him, and in the following days, he stayed in the hospital on a ventilator, basically, on life support.
And finally, that was removed.
On the 11th, yeah. Doctors recommended they remove it, and he died.
Okay. And he was 40 years old, right? So, as you say, National City Police, they say McNeil's suspected of being under influence of a drug. What does his family say about this?
Well, his family says that he has self-medicated at times, that he does suffer from mental illness. He has bipolar disorder, they said, and at times that he did self-medicate. That's no surprise for them.
All right, we do have a soundbite from family spokesperson Tasha Williamson. Let's hear that.
I think that chief is a coward. He sat on June 18th with a family, and he smirked and he smiled while he was talking to them. They were crying. They were upset visibly. He smirked and he smiled the entire time, just like he was here. He told them his officers did nothing wrong. We said, if that's the case, release the tapes. And he said no.
All right, and we're referencing these tapes. It's really unclear what tapes there might be, as you said.
Exactly. It's unclear, and we don't know what is available. We don't know if there's dash cam video available, body cam video. For certain, if everything happened in the location that police say it happened in, there would be recordings of the initial altercation. At the very least. And
what's the police chief say about all this, about tapes and about some of the harsh criticisms and complaints that we're hearing here?
Sure, and there is harsh criticism because, you know, just in Chicago, they recently released video of an altercation between a man and officers where that man was fatally shot. The question is why can't this video be released? So there's video, we just don't know what all it is. He says that the reason that they can't release it is because, one, it's still under investigation, and two, because he feels that there's no one particular incident in the video that shows where Mr. McNeil died, as it would in a shooting.
And the family and the public is saying, well, you know, if that's the case,
sure,
let's release it and let's let everybody take a look. Right?
Exactly.
Jeff?
The family says that the chief told them that his officers did nothing wrong. I wonder how he reached that conclusion.
Exactly. He continued, and he said that again in Tuesday's meeting when I asked him. I said, well, what, you know, when are you going to release that tape? And he went back and said again, my officers did nothing wrong. Even though this investigation is still ongoing, even though there's not been a medical examiner's report, a toxicology report, he's already come to that conclusion.
But the police did reveal some evidence that would seem to favor them. No trauma on the body, according to investigators present at the autopsy. But the family disputes that, right?
Exactly. The family disputes that. They say that they saw bruising on his head, on Earl McNeil's head, on his arms, on his legs, and they said that they were told by doctors in the hospital that he suffered from traumatic nerve damage in his brain. And so that's what put him on life support, is what they were told by doctors in the hospital.
All right. And as we said, this happened back in May. Why did the police say the investigation is taking so long?
They're putting it on toxicology reports. And, you know, we understand that toxicology results sometimes take 6 to 8 weeks to come back. And that's according to the medical examiner's office. So any day now.
Okay, any day now, because they, I think it was in some of the reporting, it said the reporter, or the coroner that is, noted that 90% of autopsy reports, including toxicology,
sure,
are done within 60 days, and we're almost up to that,
exactly,
that threshold.
Just a few days from that. And, you know, when I last spoke to the chief, he said it'll be another 2 to 3 weeks before they get anything back.
Andrew?
I think if we look at, you know, the history of National City and the demographics there, you can't be entirely surprised that this is blowing up in the way that it really has, because this is a disproportionately low-income community, disproportionately minorities, and they've suffered a lot of injustice over the decades. The freeway was built through their downtown, and that basically cut off much of the residents from San Diego Bay. It you know, worsened air quality, which, you know, they suffer from higher asthma rates. I think this city, you know, there's been a lot of injustice and frustration, I think, with the authorities for a very long time in the city, and I think that certainly has contributed to, you know, how explosive this has become.
Sure, exactly. And even when you're out there, you know, it's not even just the Earl McNeil case. There are a number of cases where people have lost loved ones or feel that they were brutalized at the hands of the National City Police Department. So there's a real big disconnect between the community and the police department there.
And describe the scene for us at the confrontation in that meeting room. That's a pretty extraordinary circumstance.
Sure. So, you know, they opened that meeting up with public comment, and people came up to voice their concerns over this particular case and just over the policing in general. At one point, someone went over their time limit, and then
it's usually 3 minutes in this meeting.
3 minutes, and someone went over that time limit, so they figured the meeting was out of order, and you had the council get up and leave the chambers. And at that point, you had people start to yell, "Who killed Earl McNeil? Who killed Earl McNeil?" And they were asking that to the police chief, who was sitting there in the corner. So we were able to kind of corner him and get some questions answered about what's going on with the tape. Eventually, the meeting resumed, and everyone got up and left again as soon as those public comments started.
Yeah, so really
only
unusual.
2 people stayed behind.
Yeah, 2 council members, the only 2 women of color on the city council, Mona Rios and Alejandra Sotelo Solis. Yeah.
Right, and I talked to them. They said they decided to stay the second time around because they wanted answers too.
Okay. A little short time left on this. It's a local story so far, but it hasn't garnered the national attention. We heard in the bite at the top there, somebody saying, you know, this could be Ferguson coming here. What's your guess on why so far this hasn't gone beyond a local story?
Right. And, you know, and I'm from Ferguson, so that's where I was born and raised. And so I think that the handling of this has, 1, been different, and 2, I really just think that people have been very patient so far with this whole process. And that's why it's not blown up in the same way.
But obviously that patience running out. Well, everybody will be following it up here when that coroner's report and the investigation finally comes forth, and we'll see what happens here.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you. Great reporting. Very interesting story. Going to move on. It was a problem so vexing, city council members called themselves dysfunctional in the chase for a solution. What to do about short-term vacation rentals. And Andrew, what exactly did the San Diego Council come up with? Because we've been talking about this a long time on this show. It's literally taken years, and suddenly, well, we have a solution of sorts.
Yeah, we'll see. Well, let's first distinguish between two types of short-term rentals. So there's home sharing, which the ordinance distinguishes between home sharing, where a host remains in the home on site, and they're renting out, say, a spare bedroom or two. And then there's whole home rental, where they rent out the entire home and the owner does not stay on site. So home sharing will be pretty easy under this ordinance. You will need to register with the city, pay hotel taxes and a fee that will go towards affordable housing, but it doesn't require an expensive license. Whole home rental, on the other hand, will require a license upwards of $949.
Almost $1,000. Yeah.
Yes, and the biggest and most contentious part of this ordinance is that you will only be allowed to rent out your entire home if it's where you live most of the year, if it's your primary residence. So all of those hosts that previously were living in their home, they owned a second home, and they were renting that out full time on Airbnb, that will no longer be allowed.
All right, we're going to get into that in a minute in some of the areas that are really crying foul on that one. So in the council, who supported the plan, who was against it? It wasn't obviously a unanimous decision.
That's right. So the ultimate compromise or amended version of it passed 6-3. I would say the council member who took the most interest in working out the details of this proposal was Councilwoman Barbara Bree, who represents District 1, the northern coastal neighborhoods, including La Jolla. And also supporting it were Lori Zapp, who represents some of the other coastal neighborhoods, Pacific Beach and Mission Beach. A couple of the council members had changed their minds on this. Chris Ward, who represents downtown and a lot of the urban core, had previously supported a more permissive approach, ultimately changed his mind and said, no, we want to go with this primary residence only thing. The opponents to it, I would say the most outspoken opponent was Councilman Scott Sherman. He was talking about, this tramples over our property rights. If you have a home, if it's your property and you own it, you should be able to do with it what you want. Chris Cate, previously also another councilman, had talked about the impacts on business and that this is the sharing economy and we just need to embrace it. The mayor kind of fell in the middle on this. This was the first time that he had really taken a position one way or another on it. And he had originally proposed a slightly more permissive ordinance, but once the council amended it and passed this more restrictive one, he said, at least we got something done.
Mm-hmm. Now, the mayor, if I recall from your story, they were talking about an exemption. The mayor said, because of Mission Beach and Mission Bay, those neighborhoods, if you ever been along there, walked along the beach and the boardwalk there, you know that a lot of vacationers are in there, especially this time of year.
That's right.
And a lot of folks own those who are not on site.
Yeah, so the mayor had originally proposed unlimited numbers of licenses in Mission Beach. He said that it's a special neighborhood that's always been welcoming to visitors.
Going way back.
Going back a long time. The day of the meeting, the morning of the meeting, he amended that and recommended that they only allow two licenses per person, but if you had been paying hotel taxes to the city, and some of these vacation rentals are and some aren't, if you've been paying your taxes, you can be grandfathered in and you'll keep your license. That didn't pass ultimately. Councilwoman Lori Zapp said the same rule should apply to Mission Beach as everywhere else, and the majority agreed.
And what are the folks out in Mission Beach saying about all of that?
Yeah, well, it depends on who you ask. If you're one of those property owners who owns a home and is renting it out on Airbnb, you're making a lot of money from that, certainly, and you want to maintain that revenue source. If you're one of the long-term residents or people who lives there full-time and you see all of these vacationers coming into your neighborhood, it doesn't really feel like it's a community. You might feel like there are loud parties disrupting your peace and quiet. Then you will probably be happy with this, that this will be a more restrictive approach and try to just kind of limit some of the growth, the really explosive growth that's happened in short-term rentals over the past few years.
Yeah. Right.
I wonder
Jade?
if you think that, if you had to guess, does this mean that the area is going to be flooded with more long-term rentals, more affordable housing? I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah. So, well, I mean, it's hard to imagine Mission Beach ever being affordable.
Yeah.
But I would say that it's a lot of this is going to depend on whether this is challenged in court, whether it is amended ultimately after a review period. If this neighborhood suddenly is devoid of all visitors, I would say that's a pretty far-fetched possibility. And even if you do own one of these homes that you rent out full-time on a short-term basis, to vacationers, you can sell it and still make plenty of money. This is one thing I think we should all acknowledge, that if you're a property owner in San Diego, you're doing fine. You're doing a lot better than other people who are really struggling to get by here with the cost of living. And
even if you feel you have to sell that,
even if you have to sell a home, depending on how long you had it, you'll probably still sell it at a profit. And maybe that's going to make you a little bit less rich, but ultimately there are other people who really need housing and need homes, and I think that's the argument ultimately that won the council majority.
What's the enforcement angle here? Is the city going to dedicate new resources to enforcing this?
Yeah, so that's going to be another challenge. A lot of the opponents to this the ordinance that ultimately passed say it's the market's just going to go underground. So that $949 fee that whole home rentals will have to pay will go towards hiring new city staff, including new city attorneys, people in the treasurer's office, new code compliance and police officers, and they're supposed to be kind of at the ready to respond to any complaints that neighbors might be calling against their noisy, vacationers next door.
Sounds like a busy job answering that hotline phone on the complaints in the neighborhood.
I'm not sure $900 will cover.
Right.
Well, so the city did.
Do we even know how many of these short-term rentals there are? That's a guess, right?
So So there's a consultant that came in to San Diego close to the last minute, really, and gave some pretty reliable data that the city had been lacking for a long time. And they said that about a little more than 11,000 of these listings exist in San Diego. It's not exactly clear how many of those are full-time, year-round rentals, or how many are just listed and they'll rent them out for a couple weeks or months a year. But the city tried to do the math and said, we want these fees to be fully recovering the cost of the enforcement. And so they came up with this number of how many they expect will be paying those fees. Mm-hmm. They expect it to raise $3.5 million annually in those fees, and that will pay for all of the city staff that'll be staffing this enforcement team.
All right, a few seconds left here. Likely to be lawsuits over all of this?
That's happened in a lot of other jurisdictions. There are constitutional rights, property rights involved here. Other cities have successfully been able to keep these types of regulations, the types that San Diego is passing, on the books. So we'll see. Ultimately, it could go to the Supreme Court.
And the Coastal Commission has to weigh in, and it's another year before it even kicks in.
And the current targeted date for implementation is July 1st of next year.
All right, another story we'll be following up on. It's an interesting story. Well, we'll move on. The state of Florida is known for its sunshine law. Simply, the public's business is done in public. It's more than a century old, but even in Florida, legislators have tacked on more than 1,100 exemptions over the years. California doesn't claim such transparency. News this week of private meetings by political appointees to discuss energy policy outraged those who bird dog such power brokers. But the public, not so much. Jeff, emails released by show that these powerful state regulators, they're discussing energy policy in private, as you noted in your story. Is that legal?
Is it legal? According to the regulators, yes, and the governor's office, yes, because there's no quorum of any one of the bodies that are meeting. What these are so-called energy principals, the leaders of 5 state agencies, the chairs and the senior staff. So they're all getting together to discuss issues that are pending before their respective panels, presumably making decisions and then taking them back to their bodies and implementing the decisions that were made at these secret meetings. Interestingly, the governor's office is staffing these meetings, and these are bodies that are supposed to be independent of one another and certainly independent of any political influence. So the emails showing that the governor's staff is discussing these issues while they're pending, attending the meetings, involving themselves in the decision-making, that doesn't appear to comport with the public the state laws requiring independence on the part of these regulators.
And these regulators, these are powerful agencies, though they may be obscure to a lot of citizens.
Yes, they control everything: air, water, power, all the essentials of California's infrastructure.
And the costs we all pay for them.
Yes, many billions of dollars, tens of billions of dollars every year to California consumers. So the idea that they're discussing and dictating how specific projects should be reconciled or resolved, that they're making those decisions in private and then going back to their bodies and implementing the decisions that were made in private, that's troubling to a lot of consumer advocates and people that are open government fans.
Yeah, sounds like a classic smoke-filled room, backroom deal. Huh?
Well, yes, and just the story of acquiring these emails is pretty illustrative of how business gets done in California. It's troubling because the Utilities Commission, which was sued to release these emails, they spent years refusing to release them, and the Utilities Commission gets to act as its own judge. And so when they deny a public records request, that's it. You have to go to an appellate court, which may or may not take the case. Now, San Diego attorney Michael Aguirre, whom we all know as the former city attorney, he's refused to give up on this issue and got a appellate court in San Francisco to take the case first, then hear oral arguments, consider the material, and then make a decision ordering the Utilities Commission to release the emails. And they're from 2014, so this is 2018. The Utilities Commission wouldn't even tell me if these meetings are ongoing.
Yeah, so that's a lot of years ago, and
Yes.
And then they didn't even release all the emails they were supposed to.
And there are
at
a
the
ton
time.
of new issues confronting the state right now that are supposed to be debated in public that may or may not be, because we don't know whether these energy principles are continuing to meet in secret and make decisions in private.
Isn't the Brown Act and other California open meetings law, isn't the whole idea to be public's business should be done in the public?
Yes, the state constitution says as much as well. So that's very troubling to the Mike Aguirres of the world and the consumer advocates who want California to operate in an open and above board manner. The governor's office and these commissioners, they say that it just makes good sense to meet and make sure they're all on the same page, and it's a basic function of government, basically, is what the governor's press secretary told me. But tellingly, they wouldn't answer any follow-up questions about, why they're at the meetings when these are independent bodies and things like that.
Well, I wonder, if it makes sense for multiple state agencies to meet all together, why not have a public meeting? Why not conduct all of that in the public?
That is a great question. That was one of my follow-up questions that was unaddressed in my emails. Now, they don't come to the phone and speak to us the way most people do, but in their statements, they don't. A lot of times when they release statements, they omit any answer to follow-up questions. Mm-hmm. So it's difficult to get to the bottom of it.
Right. It seems to me this demands this would be a committee structure, as Andrew's saying. You get a few members of each body called a committee. You get together and you have a committee meeting. This is in the public. There's a transcript. It's recorded. Actions are taken. They recommend to their main agencies or the PUC. This is how it works in city councils and all sorts of agencies.
Yes, you would think so. And hats off to them for getting together so they're all on the same page, because the governor does have a vision that he wants to implement, and there's nothing wrong with his appointees to be on the same page, from the 10,000-foot level. But when they're doing the work and meeting, they should be noticed and they should be open to the public. Some of these meetings were actually happening at some of the commissioners' homes, which I found quite curious.
I'm just curious to know. Explain to me again how the PUC operates. Are they governing themselves? Are they policing themselves? Is that how this works?
Well, the PUC is an interesting governmental animal. So yes and no. They serve three different functions. They legislate, they act as judges in other proceedings, and then they adjudicate. So they make decisions. So they perform three different functions. So, and it's the same 5 political appointees that make these decisions. If you file a Public Records Act, for example, they can act as a judge and decide whether or not those records should be released. And you don't get to appeal. Your only appeal avenue is going to an appellate court, which may or may not take the case. So effectively, they are the judge, and they say, no, these records are private, which is what happened in this case. When they're rulemaking, passing legislation, so to speak, governing utilities and water providers and whatnot, those processes are more open and they're more participatory, and they set They have their meetings in public, and their staff materials is all public. So they perform a number of functions, and they don't have a lot of oversight. They generally answer to the governor who appoints them.
Any politicians jumping on this? Seems like a winning issue, saying, look, we need to strengthen our sunshine laws. The public needs to know what's going on with these powerful people.
If there have been, they haven't contacted me, so I'm not sure. I think people like things the way they are right now. The status quo seems to serve most of the interests that are represented by these bodies. I say most because obviously the consumer advocates, the ones who are tenacious enough to follow through with these requests, they don't like the status quo. And there is some litigation. It just hasn't been. This case was a win for the Mike Aguirres of the world. That hasn't applied to other cases.
Okay, and I'm sure you're going to follow up on this, and we may have some final stuff coming on San Onofre very soon on that whole settlement.
Yes, the Utilities Commission next week will consider the proposed settlement to return almost $800
All right, we're out of time, but we'll be looking for that, I'm sure. Well, that does wrap up another week of stories at the KPBS Roundtable. I'd like to thank my guests, Jade Hindman of KPBS News, Andrew Bowen of KPBS, and Jeff McDonald of the San Diego Union Tribune. And a reminder, all the stories we discussed are available here on our website, kpbs.org. I'm Mark Sauer. Thanks for joining us today on the Roundtable.